of the value, traveling off the style.
For 1975, Dodge has given Monaco all the classic styling.
Ford Granada, designed to combine an efficient use of space, fuel, and money.
70s and 80s cars have always been some of my favorites. Excessive, boxy, and plush seems to be the motto for most brands in the era. But something has always perplexed me. Why do cars from this era have a strange emphasis on 55 miles an hour? They point to it, circle it, or make it stand out from the rest. Why is that? Let's talk about it. To understand the 70s, we have to talk about the 50s and the 60s. The 1950s and 1960s were a booming era for cars. The tail fins weren't the only big things about these cars. Their engines were too. Lots of straight sixes, slant sixes, and the king of all, V8s. Fuel economy wasn't on anyone's mind, nor was the idea that one day we could run out of fuel. So automakers shoved giant engines into solid steel boxes, put some wheels on it, and made it look pretty. It should be noted that this was mostly an American idea as well. Overseas, 4-cylinders were more popular, something that would decimate American cars in the next decade. A decimation we still feel the effects of to this day. The 1970s started how the 1960s ended. Big engines are better, but in 1973, the oil crisis hit.
The American automobile, for so long the symbol of America's wealth and extravagance, is dying.
Saudi Arabia, which was a huge manufacturer and exporter of crude oil, was upset with nations that supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War and thus embargoed oil exports. This included the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, the Netherlands, Portugal, Rhodesia, and South Africa. Oil prices in the US rose over 300% and caused shortages worldwide. Because of this crisis, the national government passed the National Maximum Speed Law in 1974. This limited any road from having a speed limit higher than 55 miles an hour in an effort to reduce the consumption of fuel and thus create less demand. There was a nearly immediate outcry against this law, with several oppositions coming to the table that same year, but nothing was changed. It even became featured in pop culture, most notably making up the opening scene to the 1980 film Cannonball Run. No matter the outcry, the law stuck, at least for the time being. However, this law is not specifically why you see an emphasis on 55 miles an hour on speedometers. There was a separate, more specific law change in 1979 during the second wave of the oil crisis. The Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, or FMS, for short, required speedometers to highlight 55 miles an hour in some certain way, as well as not exceed 85 miles an hour in total. That being said, the speedometer could have more lines above 85, just no more numbers, which is like saying you can only build a 5-story building, but anything taller, you just can't number the floors. The Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards is responsible for the standardization a vehicle must meet in order to be legal here in the US, such as requiring VIN numbers in 1981, third brake lights in 1986, and airbags in 1997. These laws also made imported 4-cylinder cars more attractive than gas-guzzling American cars. This is why we saw a huge rise in imported Japanese cars over the 1970s and 80s. They were cheap and fuel efficient, so when there were fuel shortages, your Corolla could go further than your neighbor's Continental. Around 1978, there was a huge shift to downsize American cars, but their idea of downsizing was switching to sub-6-liter V8s and making their cars fit in only one parking space. But I digress, maybe that's for another video. This speedometer law did not last long, being revoked in early 1982 since it seemed to have little to no effect on speeds or safety, as well as it failed to add a sufficient amount of extra information to drivers. By the early 1980s, most states began rebelling against the maximum speed limit law. What was originally a law for fuel economy soon became marketed as a safety law, since there seemed to be little to no impact on fuel consumption. Because there was such a shift in the reasoning reasoning behind the law, the public started to lose faith in the lawmakers and their decision. Fines began to be lowered for those who were caught speeding, and some departments began to pull people over less and less, making the speed limit law nearly useless. In 1987, Congress started allowing rural, low population areas to go up to 65 miles an hour. The roads had to be built to interstate standards, which allowed 7 states to immediately participate. In 1991, President H.W. Bush signed a bill to allow all states to raise rural speed limits to 65 miles an hour, regardless of how the roads were built. 4 years later, in 1995, the government lifted all federal laws on speed limits, and once again left it to the individual state, just like it had been before 1974. So even after they were no longer legally required to, many manufacturers still put an emphasis on 55 miles an hour through the 80s and even into the 90s. There was plenty of cost that went into redesigning dashboards and changing things, and since it didn't really hurt, they just left it. This is a 1993 BMW 750iL, and it still had an emphasis on 55 miles an hour nearly 10 years after it wasn't legally required to. So, that's why some cars have 55 highlighted on the speedometer. It was legally required for a short period of time in an effort to cut down on fuel consumption during the oil crisis.